We go for refuge to all the Buddhas, so that all sentient beings may realize Buddhahood. We go for refuge to all the Buddhas, so that all sentient beings may realize Buddhahood. We go for refuge to all the Buddhas, so that all sentient beings may realize Buddhahood. So this afternoon, I'm going to talk about Buddha nature. I've been talking about Buddha nature on Fridays when I'm talking you through my doctoral thesis on Buddha nature. But I thought I'd give a talk, more general talk, and to share with you some of the discussions that came up in Vienna recently. For those of you who don't know, I was last week, is it? Yes, last week. I was in Vienna at an academic symposium at the university with 25 other speakers in just 3 days. So it was quite intense. And these were academics who specialized in Tathagata, which is another word for Buddha nature. And so we got each speaker coming forward, talking based on different texts and different traditions, different teachers, and coming from different points of view, trying to work out what Buddhism had to say about Buddha nature, what was meant by it. And so it's very much on my mind. I had to give a paper. I was asked to give my paper from the point of view of a practitioner. So there I was among all these academics, thinking, how can I give a talk on Buddha nature from the point of view of the practitioner among such erudite people who know, who could pick me up on anything I might say and say, well, that's too much of a generalization, and at the same time knowing that quite a few of those people were practitioners and had done 3 years through TEAT and had been students of my teachers as well as other teachers. So it was an interesting situation, really. How do you talk as a practitioner among people who know much more than you? Who know much more than you, and maybe have even more meditation experience, and you've been asked to speak as a practitioner. But anyway, I seemed to hit the right note. Tara was listening, and she said that people responded very well to being told what's what. But it is an interesting phenomenon that I think generally speaking, Buddhism is presented as its speciality is that the Buddha taught there's no self. You see this in school books and textbooks, and people say, yes, well, the Buddha taught there's no self, and sometimes that's sort of made a little bit more humane sounding by saying the Buddha taught selflessness. And I always think that's rather clever, even though that doesn't quite correspond to the teaching of anatta, not self in Buddhism, but it does capture that sense that when you don't cling to yourself, you are a much better person. You're more open, clear, and sensitive. You're selfless. You're kind. So that's rather a nice connotation. So I'm not against using the word selflessness, but not as a translation of anatta, actually. Otherwise, all the textual sources don't quite make sense, and the arguments don't make much sense. So I found it really difficult preparing my talk for that conference. Nonetheless, it's filled my mind so much, I thought, I can't really think about anything else, so you're going to have a dose of it. But there's the papers will be published, and They were all recorded, and they're creating the Zadra Foundation, which was the symposium was sponsored by Zadra Foundation that sponsors practitioners and scholars who want to, practice seriously in the Buddhist tradition. And so they're and also by Vienna University, Vienna Department of, is it Tibetan Studies, isn't it? I think, or is it in Asian and Tibetan Studies? Anyway, they're very well endowed. There were 7 academics from Vienna giving papers. There were 7 Americans giving papers. There was, I think, 2 or 3 Japanese and a Chinese and a Bhutanese. Several, 1 or 2 or 3 Khenpos from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and from different Tibetan traditions. So it was Nyingma's Drigun Kagyu, where followers of the Karmapa Karma Kagyus. So we're Karma Kagyus in the sense that our teachers are from the Karma Kagyus. So I'd never run into Drigun Kagyus before. But where all the Kagyus are Dakpa Kagyus, or the ones that follow on from Gampopa, or Dakpa Kagyus. So we're Dakpa Kagyus because we follow on from Gampopa. So there was a paper about Gampopa and his views on Buddha nature, and Drigung, no, what's it called? Jigten Sumji Gombo, isn't it? Jigsum Gombo is the big figure that the Drigun Kagyus were talking about a lot. And then Nyingma's Mipam Rinpoche, his take on what Buddha nature was. And we were given this nice little booklet, which I'll hand around, you can have a look at, with a little abstract of each person's talk and a little picture of them, and their name and where they're from, or what they're representing, really. And there we are, up there with University of Vienna, University of Virginia and Princeton, and Awakened Heart Sangha. And there were friends from the Padmakara translation group that are based in France. So there was an old friend of mine who I hadn't seen for decades, and then another lady who came to the conference who I hadn't seen since 1972, I think, and she said I was the first person who translated for her with Kala Rinpoche, right in the early days in India when I was a nun. So it was special in all sorts of ways. Very interesting. There's a lot to absorb and understand, but we did have copies of most people's papers. Most of these people have written books or translated works that you can now put a face to the authors of these books, and it was all good fun. So now what am I going to talk about? That's the question. So I thought I'd call this talk Self and Tathagata and Openness, Clarity, Sensitivity, Mandala Principle. Well, let's say DHB. Because one of the questions after I've given my talk from a practitioner's point of view, in passing I mentioned that when I'm training my students, I don't use the term Buddha nature or Tathagata that much, but I always take it as a given that I'm teaching about Tathagata or Buddha nature from a Shentong point of view, which some of you might be familiar with. Anyone who's not familiar with what I might mean by a Shentong point of view? Right, so other people have got a vague idea, at least. So when I was writing my doctoral thesis, the orthodoxy within the academic world in the West was that the Gelug view was the orthodox proper view, and then there were deviant views like the Shentong view. And So I was writing my doctoral thesis in that context of an examiner, very eminent scholar, for decades, really, who wrote his big work on Tathagata in French, thick thing in French, all these big quotes from the Gelugpa point of view, which I had to oppose. And my examiner was also had the same sort of sense that was the orthodox view. So I had to be very careful what I said. But nonetheless, it's all right in the academic world to write about a point of view, especially if you have to be very careful if you know you're talking against some opposition. But there is a sort of discipline to that, which was hard work anyway. So in those days, to be a practitioner at Oxford was kind of suspect. Could you really be objective if you were actually believed in this stuff? On the assumption that not believing in it was somehow objective, but we'll put that aside. But the atmosphere has completely changed in the decades that have followed, so that in Vienna the Gelugpas were well outnumbered, hardly represented, and it was all taken as given. Was this the same Shentong view as this? Talking all the time, talking from a kind of Shentong point of view, and those who opposed it as if somehow, they had to justify themselves. So, and I was very gratified to find these scholars coming up to me one after another saying, "Oh yes, I read your book all those decades ago, and it really set me going on the, the direction of my further research, and I've scribbled all over it. You should see it. I've read every page." Oh well, that's really gratifying after all the work I put into it. So yeah, that was fun. That was really fun that they had actually read it and built on it. So I felt I'd accomplished what Khenpo Rinpoche has sent me to Oxford to do, which to kind of get the Shentong view into the, into the...
arena?
Yes, the arena of discussion, that it was known about and people were discussing it and talking about it. So, and the topic of self came up. And after I gave my talk, I'll come back to this topic of self, but what is self? What is the self, or what is the person in Buddhism? There's this popular idea that the Buddha taught there's no self. But if there's no self, what are we talking about when we say we're going to follow the path to liberation? We're going to take refuge in the Buddha. What do we mean when we say I'm going to take refuge in the Buddha? What is that? If you like, what is that, and why do they call the Tathagata the true self? In the Mahayana Sutras that teach about Buddha nature, they talk about the true self. Is that really so revolutionary? And this is one of the questions that I brought up in my paper. Some years back, a Theravadan scholar from Thailand came to see me, and he was very excited because he'd been writing about a big debate that had been going on in Thailand between those people who said that nirvana was the true self and those people who said no, nirvana is the ultimate truth of there's no self. Like it's not self, there's no self. And when you realise that, that's nirvana, and the others were saying no. When you realise the true self through your meditation experience, then you know what is not self, and you can truly abandon it, and that's the big special thing that Buddhism teaches. So that sounds very much like a Shentong view of Tathagata Garbha, actually. And you'll find many books will refer to this as a completely non-Buddhist view. And then you'll start to get an understanding of why there's so much discussion and about, well, what is the Buddhist view or not? I think I'll read to you the abstract from Dorji Wongjuk, because I think it captures the sense of the debate quite well. So his paper was called Rongzompa on Tathagata and Praticca Samutpada. That's usually translated as dependent origination. So Rongzompa was 11th century Nyingma teacher, very great famous teacher in the Nyingma tradition. So the critique of the Tathagata doctrine by the two Japanese scholars Shiro Matsumoto and Noriaki Hakamaya has compelled scholars engaged in the study of Buddhism to reflect on the Buddhist status of the doctrine. These two writers were writing, I think, about maybe 20 years ago. They were causing quite a rumpus because they were saying that the Tathagata teaching that was taught in Japan was responsible for the oppression of the Japanese people, because it taught that everything is enlightenment, that you are already enlightened, everything is already perfect, so shut up and get on with it, If you're being exploited, well, that's okay, see it as perfect. So they were... You can see how teaching like that could be used by an elite to somehow try to justify the status quo. This happens, doesn't it? People use religious ideas for their own ends. So there was a big, hoo-ha about this. Well, was this truly a Buddhist teaching or not? While the agenda and the underlying motives of these two scholars may be different, their dismissal of Tathagata doctrine as non-Buddhist may have been inspired by some position also found in Tibetan Buddhism. So he's a Bhutanese in the Tibetan tradition, but it's the Nyingma tradition. To my knowledge, however, Tibetan Buddhist scholars have never gone to the extent of, or he makes up words, or maybe this is in the dictionary, apodictically rejecting the theory as non-Buddhist, while some Tibetan Buddhists, for example the Dopapa or Jonangpa's interpretation of Tathagata has certainly been called non-Buddhist. So I was particularly defending the Jonangpa tradition of Dopapa, who lived about the same time as Rangjung Dorji, the third Karmapa, and Longchenpa. Actually, they were the three great omniscient teachers of which century would it be? 14th century, I think, in the 1300s. One of the most significant criticisms of the Tathagata doctrine is that it contradicts or disregards the doctrine of dependent arising, that's Praticca Samutpada, which has been eulogized as the quintessence of the teachings of the Buddha. So this is a topic that I'm really been quite concerned about for several years, and thinking about a lot what is meant by what's usually translated as dependent arising. And in English, dependent arising sounds like something we could comprehend quite straightforwardly. One thing depends on another. And yes, everything depends on everything else. Okay, we accept that. That's Buddhist teaching. But that's a bit facile. And when you look more closely, you find there's this expression, dependent arising, is often, what's the word? It's conflated with relative truth, and then these two terms are used interchangeably for almost everything. And I was telling people yesterday at my talk on Tathagata from my thesis that during the morning I'd found 19 different ways that relative truth and dependent arising were being used that were actually different. So by the time you're reading a translation with these arguments between these different writers, and it's using dependent arising and relative truth, well, you might easily not be able to follow the argument at all, because there's so many different distinctions that are sliding around there in the translation, let alone in the original. They were already translations from Sanskrit. They were already sliding around, and now they're translated into English. They're sliding around even more. So, if you find Buddhist books on doctrine rather opaque, it doesn't surprise me, because not many of them are very careful in making these distinctions. And even if you are careful, it's very difficult to express them in a way that doesn't make them sound even more obscure. So Buddhism doesn't have to be that complicated, but it's the difference between a practice meditation tradition where you're being taught how to practice directly by a teacher who knows how to teach it. Then you can get away with relatively few words, and you can get to an experiential level and understand it experientially without having to go into all these intellectual arguments. But if once an argument has begun and you've tried to answer it, then weaknesses in your argument will be picked up and thrown back at you, and you've had a choice: are you going to have another go or give up on the argument and say, well, I'm just going to go off to my cave and meditate? That's Jigme Lingpa apparently said that was the best commentary he ever had on Tathagata was to sit in his cave and meditate. So, but then again, just going off to your cave and meditate, if you sit down with the wrong view, you can actually just entrench your wrong view even more. Go on for years and years entrenching your wrong view. So we do have to be discriminating and careful, and make sure we're keeping an open mind and checking out our understanding with people who at least understand more than us, if not have the complete understanding. So that's my little words of encouragement, that you don't have to think, oh my God, this is so complicated. All these great scholars, over hundreds of years haven't been able to sort it out. How are we going to sort it out? And I think from my point of view, what's important is that I teach in a certain way and I can justify it in terms of these scholastic arguments. I can come back at them, and if they really want to know, then they could, if they're really open, they can learn something. And if they don't want to know, well, let them call us what they want, because people will always have opinions, won't they? But also for my students to know that if they hear people saying, oh, the Shentong view is controversial, you can confidently say that, yes, and so is yours. It's not like there is an orthodox view that's not controversial. And because I have had that happen. I've had students come to me and say, oh, well, I've heard that the Shentong view is controversial, so I'm going to go somewhere else. And I'm thinking, well, that's not going to solve it. You'll find their view is also controversial. Just because someone's arguing with you doesn't make you wrong. They've got to come up with good arguments, haven't they? And we've got to come up with good arguments, and I think we can. But, yeah. Over the decades since the Gelugpa Rangtong view held sway as orthodoxy, everything's been revolutionized in the Western academic world. But then, of course, it'll probably be revolutionized again. So we can't rest on our laurels. Anyway, in this paper, I wish to re-examine how the 11th century Nyingma scholar Rongzum Touchy Zangbo interprets Tathagata theory, particularly in relation to paticca samuppada, that's dependent arising, and whether or not he viewed Tathagata and paticca samuppada theories as mutually contradictory. So there's bad news. Could it possibly be that two threads of the teaching of the Buddha could be mutually contradictory? And what would that mean? What could that possibly mean? So then we have to kind of think about, well, what does Tathagata mean? What do we think it means? I think sometimes when we hear from Trungpa Rinpoche's teachings about basic goodness, in the Shambhala teachings it talks about basic goodness, and you think, oh, well, that must be our Buddha nature. and I'm sure it refers to our Buddha nature in a way, but is basic goodness sufficient to capture the meaning of Tathagata? And when I'd given my paper, I was asked, well, when you're teaching your students, do you refer to Buddha nature and Tathagata? And I said, actually, not that often, really, because what I usually say is I use the terms of the three qualities that are used in the Mahamudra and Dzogchen tradition for the true nature of mind. Mind. Put it on one side for a while, but which is openness, clarity, sensitivity. So those of you who are doing the Discovering the Heart of Buddhism course will be immediately familiar. We do a lot of work on openness, clarity, sensitivity, and how they're inseparable qualities, and how they're qualities that we always have and that we have access to, and then through our meditation we can recognize more and more clearly what they really mean, starting with what they intuitively mean. When we so I said that's mainly how I talk about openness, how I talk about Tathagata. So that's why I've called my talk Self, Tathagata, and I'm going to call it DHB now. Because one of the things I notice when looking at these different teachings on dependent origination, are you all familiar with the word paticca samuppada? Who's not? Okay, so I won't use that word. I'll use dependent origination. Who's familiar with that term? Who isn't? Okay, so vaguely dependent origination. This is often given as, this is the Buddha's teaching. This is the, sometimes you hear it called not self, sometimes you hear it called dependent origination. And sometimes that's translated as everything is it's no real essence, it's all causality. It's just everything is causes and conditions and impermanent, and there's no self. So that's often said. So then the implication is these causes and conditions that are not self are somehow self. What am I? I am all these causes and conditions, which is then sometimes translated as paticca samuppada, or dependent origination, which is a very specific term used in specific contexts in the Buddhist tradition, but in English sounds quite accessible, doesn't it? Dependent origination. Things arise dependent on conditions. And that, who's going to argue with that? It's kind of, sounds very rational, very unproblematic. It doesn't require any act of faith or belief. And then to call that relative truth sounds quite, that sounds quite, not problematic. I can go along with that. It's kind of almost like common sense, isn't it? So, where was I going?
You were using a complicated term and you said, I'm not going to use...
Right, paticca samuppada, yeah. I need a whiteboard to put these terms up. But anyway, dependent origination. That's right. He was talking about, does it contradict Buddha nature? So when we say all beings have Buddha nature, they have this changeless nature, which is the nature of the Buddha. It's primordially within them, so that we are already, in essence, Buddha. That sounds very different from saying we are the flux of impermanent causes and conditions, doesn't it? Are we an illusion based on changing causes and conditions? It seems like we're something, but actually we're not anything. So we need to accept that, and then we'd be happier. Well, to a certain extent, we are happier because then we're not clinging on so hard. But at a certain point, you begin to wonder, yeah, but so what? You know, like what could become liberated from those causes and conditions then, if there is only causes and conditions? So, is this teaching about self, the true self, or Tathagata, the changeless nature, the indestructible heart essence, the Buddha nature? Is that a kind of reaction against the nihilism of thinking you're just a constantly changing collections of fleeting experiences? It's quite difficult to say, isn't it? It's like when we really think about what's another person, or what am I, what's another person, especially when you start to think what happens at death. Do I continue at death? Well, does what continue? What are you talking about? What is this? What is it that might continue? What is there about you that might continue? Clearly, it isn't your body. So then, is it your mind? And then, okay, well, is my mind my brain? In which case, it doesn't continue. But what basis is there for saying that the mind is the brain? I mean, you can look at a brain, you can analyze a brain, you can see it's made of bits and pieces, particles and impulses and all sorts of changing things. But is that actually what I mean by my mind? When I talk about my mind and my life and my connections with people or the meaning of my life, has it got anything to do with all of that? What do I actually mean by, what gives my life meaning even? So the Buddha was using the word, he was using self and I or you for that which we are seeking to liberate, because we're suffering because we don't understand really our true nature. So we're seeking our own true nature, which you could say you're seeking your own true self. You could use that. And in this argument that was going on in Thailand between these great scholars and practitioners about, is Buddhism about the true self, or is it about there's no self? Just forgotten what I was going to say. This question came up. What did I say just before that? I'm testing you.
Suffering as we don't understand our true nature, our true self.
That's right. So they asked Mahabuha, who's a very famous bhikkhu in Thailand, what he thought about this debate about calling nirvana self. And he said, I don't see any problem with that. So they said, you're on our side. And the other side got, Mahabuha's saying these things, these non-Buddhist things. And then he said, no, I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to meditate. I'm not going to get into this argument. It's beyond self and not self, which is, that's a very interesting position. It's beyond all concepts. So, I'm not. But then you can't say it's beyond self and not self if you don't already have some sense of meaning of what self and not self is. So you do need these words to even have a discussion about something being beyond self and not self, which that's a valid position. And in fact, that's one of the things that came out during the conference, that Tathagata is beyond all concepts of self and not self. That's what Tathagata is. That's what Buddha nature is. It's beyond all concepts. You're going to need to talk about that quite a lot to understand what that really means. So there's these two ideas, that there is this true nature, our own true nature, which is something to be discovered and revealed, and actually turns out to be no less than Buddha, and Buddha turns out to be no less than totality, and totality turns out to be nothing other than our own heart or mind when we truly understand it without any grasping at false illusions. So that sounds the business, doesn't it? So why would anybody be arguing against that? And what are they arguing? Because this has been what I've just said has been fiercely opposed by great Buddhist scholars and commentators for centuries. So what are we missing? Most of the time, I just teach from the point of view that I just said, that we have within us the qualities of openness, clarity, sensitivity. As you connect more to them in your experience, you notice that you're able to let go, to clinging to egocentric thinking and the suffering associated with that. And as you gain more confidence in that, you find that the good qualities of love and compassion and faith and devotion and deeper understanding and enthusiasm for Dharma just decreases. So that's all you need to know, really. But on the other hand, we can get attached to our view. We can get attached to, well, I know, I've got this indestructible heart essence of openness, clarity, sensitivity. So, I'm all right. You can't criticize me. I'm fine. And it becomes just an idea that you're attached to. And then when you find you're going through a hard time, you can lose faith because you suddenly think, oh, I'm not so open, clear and sensitive as I thought I was. What's gone wrong with me? Without having really understood what it was that you were claiming to believe in. So it's quite good to be challenged. What do you mean by openness? What do you mean by clarity and sensitivity? Most of the time, we're unclear. We've got a kind of muddled view of things. Like we have our moments of inspiration when we hear Dharma and read Dharma and do some serious practice. We get very inspired, and then when we look at how we're thinking most of the time, it's quite narrow and quite effortful and quite struggling with things that we think are real, and we can't quite let go of them because they seem so real even though they're quite negative. So how do we tackle that mind that keeps slipping back into this sort of narrow-mindedness? And it's quite good to use these arguments that are used against the true self or the Tathagata. Like, what do I think the mind is? And if you don't think your mind is like your heart, the essence of your being, your true Buddha nature, what do you think the mind is? And I'm often surprised that people think the mind is their brain, but we'll leave that for today. I think most people recognize, though, that they do think of their mind as being a stream of events. What I thought a minute ago, that mind that was thinking that is past. I can't access it again. Even if I remember it, it's now in the present. So I'm like a disappearing stream of mental events. The future ones haven't come, and the past ones are gone, and there's just the present moment. And the present moment seems very alive and important. And how does it join with the past and the future to make a life? It's an interesting question, isn't it? It's easy to think, oh yes, I'm a sort of timeline. The past is gone, the future's coming, and I'm just this moment of awareness going along this line. But actually, it's difficult to argue with that because I can't find any past and I can't find any future. But I can't really believe I'm just a single point in time that's just gone. That's really not, it really doesn't make sense. So what's the alternative? Anything you might think of sort of is almost like a intellectual theory of some kind. Does it help to think, oh, there isn't a self? Does that actually help? There isn't a mind. There isn't a self. Does that help? Does that bring any further clarity? Might, for a while. Should try it. But that also could become an intellectual idea, couldn't it? I think I don't have a self. And I avoid saying I to myself, but basically that's how I'm operating. That you can't blame me, I don't have a self. Well, some people do try that one. So then it really means that we have to really examine, how do we know anything really? You know, like how when I say openness, you know, like emptiness, no self, not self, what am I really experiencing? And one can experience very clearly what one's experiencing without at the same time being able to pin it down as self or not self or whatever. But still we want to talk about that. We want to talk about, so like in Discovering the Heart of Buddhism, we call it openness, clarity, sensitivity. Or the heart essence, the indestructible heart essence, or sometimes just the heart. Because we have a tremendous intuition of the true nature of reality in our hearts, actually. Because when we look for meaning in our life, we find it somehow, we might not call it heart, but something that's to do with connecting with others. You might call it love, you might call it connection, you might call it like your heart is touched, or you hold people in your heart, or you talk heart to heart, or you feel connected in your heart. Those expressions, they have some intuitive meaning. And I think that's not accidental. Like when I look at some of these very profound teachings that are so difficult to explain, and I'm looking for an example of how we might, in some sense, already intuit that, I find I almost always come back to the heart, that we have some turn of phrase that indicates that we do actually have some understanding of that. Like one of the ones I commonly use, because you hear it even on the news, even in this heathen age where, you know, materialistic age where nobody, you know, you can't assume anyone believes in anything. You can say we hold them in our hearts, you know. It's not considered mad. You know, if you sort of said, oh, I pray to God for them, we'd say, you know, in England we'd say, what's wrong with him? Doesn't he know? We don't talk like that. In America they do, but we don't here. But nonetheless, you could get away with holding people in your heart. That wouldn't. We kind of, you know, I'm sure most people say, oh well, that's metaphorical, or they would sort of toss it aside. But I think it's more than that. I think it is a genuine intuition of what really matters is our connection with each other, and we intuitively sense that what we are, and we are to each other, is actually important and valuable in itself, regardless of what experience we've had, or what status we've got, or how big or small we are. We sense that to be a person is already meaningful. And that's why we've got this big debate going on in the West now about robots. You know, okay, we're establishing to ourselves more and more that animals are people. So they might have to have rights. But then are robots people? Oh, what do we mean by people? What do we mean by person, actually? What do we mean by mind? Has a robot got a mind? Do we mean by mind being very clever at, calculations and computations and so on? Do we actually mean is that what we mean by mind? Or is it something else? I mean, I'm quite certain it's something else. But, maybe a mind could enter a robot, and then what would you do? I don't know how the body enters the body, so we might be able to enter a robot. But then, what is that person, and does it have Buddha nature? Is it Buddha nature? We're going to be faced with questions like that, aren't we? Is this what is the value of a human person? Especially when you get to the point where there's so many people on the earth, it's a threat to the earth. Is there value in keeping people alive when they get old and decrepit, or they're not fully functioning? Should they be kept alive or not? What is a person? What is the value of a person? And I think one of the reasons why we abhor suicide and euthanasia and things like that is because we're so doubtful. We've got so much doubt about what is a person. That, where do you draw the line? Better play safe and treat all life as sacred. So what's the instinct behind that? What is it we're intuiting behind that? That there is some value in a person, some ultimate value in the connection we have with other people. So I think Tathagata Garbha is a lot about that. That beings do have value. They're not just illusion. Because, you can see they're just causes and conditions coming together for a brief time and then they break up. And that they are of anything of any consequence is an illusion. And that instinctively feels like destroys the whole meaning of life, doesn't it? What's the point of anything if that's all we're talking about? But if we're not talking about that, what are we talking about? When we say Tathagata Garbha, Buddha nature. Well, I had all these notes about things I could talk about, and I've hardly started. So are you up for more? Maybe we should have a discussion. Yeah. Tara was talking to somebody from Shambhala Publications, weren't you? And she was asking that I write a book on Buddha nature that's accessible to, the wider public. And that's been on my list of things to do since I finished my thesis, 30 years ago? Thinking, yes, I'll write a short version of my thesis. Several people have tried to write a short version of my thesis, but got immediately into trouble because if you simplify it, you find yourself opening yourself to being argued, to the words you've chosen and the sentences you've said. That's a really clear way of putting the view, but it's a Shentong view, but if you had a Rangtong view, you would read a completely different meaning into that. So, I think I'm going to have to write this book myself, but it gets more complicated, not simpler, to try and explain it clearly. And that's why I've started doing these lectures on a Friday, going through it slowly to show you all why it's so difficult to write a short book to explain all these points, because, if you come out at the beginning and say, I'm speaking from a Shentong point of view and I'm not going to discuss any other view, that could be relatively straightforward. But then that's not going to persuade people who've heard a Rangtong view. They're going to think, oh, well, this is obviously the wrong view, and not want to engage with it. So then you have to concede, okay, then there's this other view, and then immediately it gets complicated. So I'm not too sure how I'm going to write a simpler book on Buddha nature. I'm still thinking about it. But anyway, the points that I brought out today, I could have, they could go into my book, couldn't they? I've talked about the central ideas of Buddhism. I don't know if you're aware of, I think it's called the Four Seals of what it's like the creed of Buddhism. What makes Buddhism Buddhism? There are four things. Do you know what they are, the Four Seals? That nearly all compounded things are impermanent. All compounded or tainted things are suffering. All dharmas are not self, and nirvana is peace. So if you don't teach that, then you're not teaching Buddhism. That's the idea. But they can argue, they see this big argument in Thailand is over this third one, that all dharmas are not self. They say, some people say that means all compounded dharmas are not self. It doesn't mean that nirvana itself is not self. And so the argument is around that line. So that was one of the papers, was discussing what all dharmas, some, like what different commentators mean by all dharmas, and what's meant by dharmas, and what's meant by compounded dharmas, and what's meant by non-compounded dharmas, and so on. So it seems simple enough, doesn't it? Those four things, but even within those four statements, you can have radically different views about what they mean. And then there's the standard 20 wrong views that are referred to when we do the praise to the three jewels. What is it? Shrouded in the wall of doubt, concealed in the dark confusion of wrong views. There are 20 wrong views. 4 for each skandha. There's 5 skandhas, so 4 for each. So if we were to condense it then down to 4 wrong views about the skandhas, so that's body, feelings, perceptions, formations, and consciousness that we name each day in the Heart Sutra. So they're not the self. They don't belong to the self. They're not in the self, and the self is not in them. So these are the 4 views. So that you could say the self is not form. Form doesn't belong to the self. The form is not in the self, and self is not in form. So with those views, if you go through each of them, feeling, perception, consciousness, they're not the self, they don't belong to the self, they're not in the self is not in them, not in sound. So you're left with, well, what is self then? It's not in, and the skandhas are not in it, it's not in self. And then the Buddha says again and again, so therefore abandon the skandhas, abandon those things that are compounded. And when it says compounded, it means that your mind has made up from, you've got these different experiences, different feelings, different forms, and you're creating a sort of idea of your body and the world and the feelings and consciousness. You're creating these, you're compounding these experiences into actual things that then you grasp onto. But actually they are compounded, you can't grasp onto them. Your mind has made it all up. So therefore abandon all that, and that's how you find your true nature, which is not something that's compounded and that you could grasp. So it's pretty straightforward and simple, and if only they'd left it that way. But it got twisted quite early on, and one can speculate about why, but they changed that 4th one to, so that the 4 now go, in the Commentarial tradition, this is the Theravada and Commentarial tradition, skandhas are not the self, well, that's form, feeling and so on, are not self, they don't belong to the self, are not in the self. and the self, and they're not outside the self. So now you can't find a self inside, you can't find a self outside, you can't find a self at all. So now you're not using self for your true nature, you're now saying there isn't a nature, there isn't anything that's yourself. So then that starts to complicate the dialogue, and if you look into the commentaries and the discussions and the arguments, you can see it led to endless arguments about what the Buddha, what was the self and what wasn't the self, and what you do if you don't have a self.
Could you just read out the two last ones?
So the first one said the self is not in the Skandhas. No, the Skandhas are not in the self, and the self is not in the Skandhas. So not inside, not outside, but there's an implication somehow you're still looking for the self. Whereas the second formulation, they're not in the self and not outside the self either. So the self has nowhere to be at all. So it's excluded the possibility that you're looking for the true self, because there isn't a true self either in or outside the Skandhas.
Oh, I see, yeah.
There's no true self to be found, so stop looking for it. So then you're looking for something, you're looking for liberation. What are you now going to call it? So that's why I think something like the Tathagata doctrine came in. Let's call it Tathagata. That's what we're seeking to realise, the Tathagata, because and it is referred to as the true self. One of its ways of referring to it is as the true self. And as the true self beyond self and not self, in other words, the self beyond any conceptual grasping at self and not self. So it sort of comes back to the same point using different terminology. So you can have confidence in the tradition as a whole, even though the terminology is sliding around, and some spurious arguments are being used. You have to learn to spot those as spurious and keep on track, not be put off by these views that have slipped in, because the main tradition, from my point of view, the main tradition is the one we're following. That's what the Buddha said originally. That's what the Mahamudra and Dzogchen teachers are saying the same way. That's how to many of the other practice traditions in the Zen and the Theravada tradition are still saying. There's a strong body of opinion that's saying the same thing, although there happens to be a strong body of opinion who's arguing against it, which one wishes they weren't. But since they are, we have to be a bit wary, and we have to, somebody has to be able to answer them. If we're going to be open to discussion and not just be dogmatic, one has to be open to a certain extent to answer these opposing views. So then, over time, this term, instead of using self, or even Buddha nature, the term nature of mind is used in Mahamudra and Dzogchen. They use nature of mind, trying to realize the nature of mind. What are we seeking? We're seeking to discover the true nature of mind. But as I point out in Discovering the Heart of Buddhism, mind in English is tends to get a little bit heady and intellectual. And in fact, it's nature of mind, which is where we would say, it's our true nature, isn't it? You'd use the same gesture. My true nature. This is your true nature of mind. Mm-hmm. It's like your true nature. So I was noticing that everybody was quite comfortable with saying it's the nature of mind, and I was wondering, I wonder when they say nature of mind, what it really they think they're saying, because mind is such a vague term in English. So another thing that's used for it is emptiness. Like in the Heart Sutra, it's called emptiness. Everything's emptiness. Everything is Buddha nature. Emptiness. It's another name for. Another name for it could be totality.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Totality.
Oh, okay.
Like there isn't anything that isn't Buddha nature. There's nothing outside of Buddha nature. So if you're going to know Buddha nature, you have to be, if you like, you have to give up any dualistic clinging and know in an intuitive sense that is actually integral to totality. And you get this is kind of the view in Japan where they talk about, what was the term they were using? Original enlightenment, wasn't it? Or so that you think you are Buddha already, because there is only Buddha and everything is Buddha and all beings are Buddha. And then the discussion is, does that mean also that rocks and stones are Buddha? And so sometimes they say yes and sometimes they say no, depending on how they're using terminology or how they're understanding the Dharma in general. So there was 3 speakers, I think, were speaking from this point of view. What was it called? Hongaku. Yeah. And this is the version of Buddha nature that was being, that Dorji Wangdruk's referring to as being, having been opposed because it's reactionary. It's used by elites to suppress people. That you are already Buddha, so just be quiet and behave. And we were talking to somebody over breakfast, a priest, a Shingon priest, Japanese priest, who's saying, yes, we're told as children, that we are Buddha, and it's more like a kind of imperative. Behave yourself, you're a Buddha, so stop that. Behave like a Buddha. You are a Buddha, so behave like a Buddha. So that was quite interesting how these...
I'll try that with my children.
Yes, you're a Buddha. Yes, you're a Buddha. You're a Buddha. I expect better of you. I found that quite amusing. But, yeah. I mean, that's an interesting aspect of a culture adopting Buddhism, isn't it? Like, how is it going to be used on that day-to-day level, and how you're going to bring up your children? What sort of way of thinking about it are they going to pick up? Like if you pick up the idea that you are already Buddha. And it explains to me why I met some Japanese Christians I met once who said at my college in Oxford, and they said, I said, why are you Christians? Here I am, I'm a Westerner converted to Buddhism. Why would a Japanese convert to Christianity? And they used exactly this point. They said, well, we Japanese, we're so sure we're good that we don't even examine ourselves. But, Christians, they're always examining themselves and finding fault with themselves. We think that's really good, really inspiring. It's interesting, isn't it? So, yes, maybe I'll leave it there since it's got a bit late. Does anybody want to have a go at asking me anything?
You started talking about something like goodness.
Oh, yes, basic goodness.
Yes. I got a bit lost into where we were left with that. It was almost like, what I understood is that you started about answering, there was an effort of answering a question, are we goodness? Or something like that.
Are we basic goodness, yes. That Trungpa Rinpoche was using this term, basic goodness, and then I went on to say that some people think that that's referring to Tathagata, Buddha nature, and then I'm not quite sure where I went from there, but
Action? Something like that?
well, I think probably where I went from there was it would depend on which version of Tathagata you thought it was the same as. So, and also, but basic goodness doesn't capture the whole meaning of Buddha nature because it doesn't include, goodness is rather general, so it doesn't capture the whole of the meaning of Buddha. So there's nothing so radical about thinking that we are basically good, although it needs to be said, and certainly in a society where there's a tradition of being told we're basically bad, it's really, quite clever to turn around and say, no, you're basically good. And it's really the same premise that we have when we're practicing non-violent communication, NVC. Marshall says, you take the assumption that a person is coming from a good place, even if they're acting in their strategy is, appalling and violent and counterproductive. Why are they doing that? It will be ultimately from a good place. And from the point of view of Buddha nature, that makes sense. It would be, wouldn't it? Because there is only Buddha nature, so it must be coming from a good place. So that's a really good intuition to go from, and nobody particularly asks, what do you mean? What do you mean good? We know what good means, we can tell. That's not good. That doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel right. It feels bad. So we already know what good means. So it was a very clever move on Trungpa Rinpoche's part to start using basic goodness, because no one's going to argue with that. Whereas if he'd said, we've all got Buddha nature, it's like opening up a can of worms. So it's quite clever, but at the same time, it's easy not to take that really to the point where it's recognizable as Buddha nature. It could just simply be a good sense of being, we are fundamentally good. What it is to be a human being or to be a being at all is fundamentally good. But why and how far does that go is it's not being discussed with that one term, is it? So you could understand it on quite a low level relative to what Buddha means. But still, very important level. Having confidence in your own goodness. It's really needed in the West.
I think I heard you say that at one point, so with the Rangtong view, perhaps if there's only causes and conditions, then it's easy to take that argument and fall into a nihilistic view. So that there will be a Shentong defence or protection from falling into a nihilistic view, and there would presumably be a Rangtong answer as well as to what protects you from falling into a nihilistic view.
Yes, the Rangtong defence of itself is that you can somehow, those causes and conditions can be changed or purified somehow, so that you do have a path to awakening, and you do have a path where your mind becomes pure, and then when it becomes pure, it has as its object, each moment of mind has as its object the emptiness, so that it's no longer grasping at things as solid and real, and somehow, which is not explained, the good qualities kind of start to adhere to that mind stream. It doesn't really have a reason for why that would be, and they don't also have a reason. The weak point in their system as well is they have to admit that when the Buddha's awareness, when you reach Buddhahood, for Buddha, there is no duality of subject and object. That the Buddha can actually act in the world when not in meditative equipoise, where he's focused on emptiness, he can actually act in the world and it's still emptiness. So how does the mind switch from moment to moment taking as an object emptiness to the Buddha's mind in which that is no longer the case? And they just have no answer, really. Whereas what we're saying is it's always like that. It's just that we don't believe it and we complicate it. But if we stop complicating it, we would have, right here and now, and we have many examples in our life, of go beyond the duality of subject-object. And I often bring up the example of mastering anything. Anything we master, we stop thinking about, don't we? We just, like in football, I think they call it, you get in the zone. You stop thinking about it because actually that is really how knowledge operates. And then as soon as we start thinking about it, it gets complicated. But if we're making a mistake, thinking can help us to undo the mistake. So, we've got to use both. But yes, they work hard at trying to find a way to justify that they don't have any as you say, any way to stop falling into nihilism, except by somehow giving status to what they call apparent reality or relative reality. So they're very touchy about saying, like, from our point of view, what is false, you give it up, get rid of it. But then from their point of view, what's false is false. If you get rid of it, then you've not got anything. So they try to give it a bit of status, and that's why you get a lot of emphasis on the two truths. You know, the truth of emptiness, and then the truth of relative reality, which is what, of course, everything is, all the causes and conditions, and that's what it actually is, which is actually quite a materialistic view. Anyway, they recognize that it's difficult, and often they therefore have they tend to have an attitude that it's very difficult to follow the path to awakening, and you therefore have to accumulate punya and, you know, go through a purification process and not have too high hopes, and probably not really encourage meditation too much.
Whoa.
You know, because you're likely not to get anywhere with it.
Oh my God.
And then you get discouraged. So you might do a little bit of shamatha to get a bit of peace of mind, but then and you might do reflection on death and impermanence, and, you know, like the importance of following the path, sort of reflections like that, thinking about the Dharma. But actually meditating in order to gain insight, you'll find in those traditions it tends to be underplayed. It's underplayed, and I've met Westerners who've experienced that they've given up on meditation because it hasn't really been taught. That's not across the board, but there is a tendency that way. And you can see why. You know, take a long view, you know, getting to enlightenment takes many eons, you know. Slow down, accept you're going to have to go slowly. Yeah. Just meditate on impermanence and, you know, not be attached to things. That's already a lot. Yeah.
I just wondered about the view of Praticca Samuppada, which is compatible with Buddha nature. Because you talked about them, a certain interpretation of the content arising, which is not compatible. So what would be the vision of?
Well, this is what I'm doing my own sort of personal research into, really, because that's how I came up with these 19 different versions of what you know, apparent reality or relative reality or dependent origination, and how that's used in contrast to emptiness. So you get emptiness and appearances, or emptiness and clarity, or emptiness and Praticca Samuppada, or emptiness and the two kayas, you know, the form kayas and the dharmakaya. And I'm looking at them and I'm thinking, so is there some consistent view going through this? Or are we talking about various different things? And when you come to Praticca Samuppada itself, in terms of the 12 links, I don't know, this is one of the basic textbook things about basic teachings of Buddhism, that, you know, from in the presence of a Vidya, you get the samskaras, the tendencies, you know, karmic tendencies. In the presence of karmic tendencies, you get consciousness, dualistic consciousness. In the presence of dualistic consciousness, you get name and form. In the presence of name and form, you get the sense bases. In the presence of sense bases, you get contact. In the presence of contact, you get feeling. In the presence of feeling, you get attachment or grasping. And in the presence of grasping, you get becoming. In the presence of becoming, you get birth. In the presence of birth, you get old age, sickness, suffering, and death. So, and the whole thing is suffering. You know, all dharmas within that layout, you know, are suffering, and not suffering is avidya changes to vidya. You know, which is rigpa in Tibetan, and in Dzogchen they use this term rigpa. Very because if avidya changes to vidya, then none of that follows. So that's the end of suffering. So how do you get avidya to switch to vidya? Avidya is not going to be able to do it, is it? Only vidya can do it. So again, you could say, well, vidya then is the Buddha nature. That is Tathagata. It isn't anything else. That's what it is. It's vidya. Yeah, what you truly are before you didn't recognize it. So avidya, which is often translated as ignorance, is not recognizing your own nature. Vidya is recognizing your own nature. So if you can make that switch, then you cut through the whole of samsara in one cut, as it were. And all these traditions that talk about immediate, what is it they talk about? The developmental, or the big argument in Tibet about immediate enlightenment, or is it developmental? Gradual, that's right. Gradual or immediate enlightenment. So that whole argument is about if you're going to gradually remove the conditions of the Paticca Samuppada, will that reveal Vidya? Well, how can it be done gradually? As long as the Vidya's there, all the rest is going to be there. So however refined it gets, it's still a Vidya. So what switches it from a Vidya? And this is where the meditation traditions would say you have to encounter Vidya in the teacher who is going to show you Vidya, pointed out to you. You're going to recognize what Vidya is, then you're going to make it the basis of your path. The Vidya becomes the basis of the path. Every time you hit Vidya, samsara collapses, but the habits are still there, so you find yourself back. But you have this sense of having glimpsed something, and that is the basis then for, the path. That is what you're trying to keep coming back to, because once you're back there is no more samsara, it all collapses. Whereas if you haven't got that teaching in your tradition, if you've only got the intellectual idea of you've got to analyze everything, this can't be analyzed because it's outside of the range of the mind that's the ordinary mind that's covered with avidya. So in the Mahamudra tradition, the Dzogchen tradition, you could say Tathagata tradition, you're trying to induce in people confidence in their Vidya, in their Buddha nature, in their true nature, because even a moment or a flash of confidence in that will cut through eons of conditions and causes and conditions that might hold you in samsara. Whereas if you try to remove the causes and conditions, and habits, if you try to move them bit by bit, it's like cutting the twigs off a big tree, hoping to cut the tree down. It's not the most efficient way of cutting a tree down, is it? You could take a long time cutting all the branches. Whereas this is cutting at the root, and they often use this expression, cut it at its root, which is that switch from Vidya to avidya. Sorry, the other way around. Yeah. The weak point in our system, of course, is how did that ever happen in the first place? And how can you be sure that it will stay that way? And again, that I call it the weak point because any system that to explain the nature of reality is never going to quite fit. You're going to get weak places where it doesn't quite fit because it's a conceptual description of something that's beyond what can be understood in that way. So it will have weak points, and this is a weak point of our system in a way. How do we know that we're not going to again fall into avidya? Having become liberated, how do we know we won't go back? And there's various attempts at answers, but I always answer with Queen Srimala's answer was, it's just amazing, isn't it? How it could be possible that the mind that is pure from the beginning should ever become obscured. First, it's amazing it isn't obscured. Second, it's amazing that it should ever be obscured if it never was obscured. And the Buddha says, indeed, that's right. That these are the two amazing things that are really difficult to realise, except for people like yourself and great bodhisattvas like yourself. So I sort of think I'm going to have to wait till I get there, and then I shall see what I should get the joke. It's the same in the Christian tradition. You've got this difficulty of explaining why did God allow evil. It's a really tricky one, isn't it? If he's all powerful, how come that he allows evil? So they have to struggle with that one, and we struggle with, well, couldn't we just slip back again? No, it's all going to be all right.
Oh dear, you've got to laugh.
You've got to laugh. Okay. So we dedicate this punya to the enlightenment of all sentient beings. May all sentient beings realize complete and perfect awakening. May the heart's awareness awaken in the unawakened. Where it has begun to stir, may it never fade, and may it awaken fully. Chanchu samne rinpoche macha panam jejejik java nyamba mevadam kane kandu pawasho. Chanchu samne rinpoche macha panam jejejik java nyamba mevadam kane kandu pawasho. Chanchu samne rinpoche macha panam jejejik java nyamba mapadam kane kandu pawasho.